Okay. All right. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Daniel Negron. I am not Dr. Michael Collins, as it says on the site, but I did work with him a lot on this work, and we actually recently presented at RSA 2017 some work. So I'm a scientist at Nobilis Inc. I do usually involved in a lot of biocomputing work. I have a lot of background in bioinformatics and biochemistry. So lately, my work has been shifting a lot towards the cyber domain as well. Use my background in computer science to kind of translate my problem-solving skills from biology to the cyber realm. So my past cyber experience has included a lot of dark web analysis, kind of trying to figure out ways to break out, kind of break up child exploitation rings over Tor and all that. Currently involved in making a malware analysis framework for the government. And so the latest stuff, I've been doing a lot of deception technology. And like I said before, Dr. Collins from RedJack and myself, we recently presented at RSA a novel approach that leverages a lot of techniques from deception and even from the malware community to protect networks from file exfiltration attacks. So that's available on YouTube, on RSA's channel. So what I'll be doing is I'll be going through a lot of the background of this work that went into that presentation. What I hope to do today is to go more into the methods. Our RSA talk was more kind of like a general talk, and I kind of want to go more into the details in this one. So I'll give a lot of background on the problem we're kind of trying to solve, like kind of the main scenarios we're looking at. The first one we term kind of the golden ticket. This is where the attacker has gained access to your file system and is trying to exfiltrate as many files as possible. Kind of straightforward, right? In a lot of cases, they use simple tools like wget, for example, or curl. And once they have all the privileges, they can make out like a bandit. The main point here is that each file, right, all your files on your system, right, they're of like heterogeneous type and structure, right. The main point here is that each file has different value to the attacker. Right? The attacker is going to be more interested in medical records, right, or secret documents, for example, right? They're not going to care about the corporate picnic flyer. And so my reason for pointing this out will be apparent shortly. So in the second scenario, this is we term the PII theft case. This is the classic attacker has gained access to your database, is doing a select all, and then just dumping everything on a paste bin site, for example. In this case, the main difference is that since the objects that are being exfiltrated are database records from a table, so everything's structured similarly, right? It's very easy for them to parse and whatnot, and probably more likely than not, they're all going to have uniform value to the attacker. And so the point is that we develop our approach that depends on simulations, right? We play adversarial games, right? We kind of model attacks on networks. And what's important when doing so is that we want to model the payoff to the attacker. So it's important to consider how much an object is worth on your system when you're kind of setting up a defensive system, like I'm going to talk about shortly. So traditionally, you have kind of like the static defense approach. This is where an analyst is looking at network behavior. And what they do is they'll select an arbitrary threshold and say, like, any spike in network traffic above this, we're going to say is weird. And we're going to raise an alarm. We also consider the fact that most likely malicious activity is going to be encrypted, so deep packet inspection is not an option. And so we don't consider it in our approach, and we don't really need to. So here we have the same view, more of a schematic view, kind of like the PII case. Attacker has compromised the host, is trying to do a select star. here the analyst, on the magnifying glass here, they selected a threshold, right? But the problem with this is that the attacker is able to exploit automation, right? They have all the time in the world. They can throttle their transfer speeds, and they can just lay low, and they pretty much win. They have succeeded in stealing all of your data, and it has gone undetected. At the same time, since you have a static threshold, right, you fall into the base rate fallacy. This is where you have a low probability event, and you're testing this frequently. You have so many events on your network that over a long period of time, you're going to get so many false positive alerts, right? These are just typical users on your network downloading big files or whatnot. And so that puts a lot of stress on the analyst, right? You want to focus your attention on relevant kind of alarms, right? And so our solution to this, we wanted to maximize the analyst's attention on real potential threats. And the way we do that is that we take a dynamic approach that incorporates a lot of elements from deception. What we did when we were starting out with this research, right, we kind of picked a very basic approach, right? What if we can model attacks, and based off modeling attacks, we can therefore kind of simulate and estimate how many resources we need to put in our deceptive techniques, right? We can model costs that we have to pay to defend ourselves, and we can model the cost to the attacker as well. And the way we do that is that we can determine, based off your own network signature, right, how big can we make our files, right? So we make our files so big to the point where it becomes intractable for them to take it off your system, right? And not only that, we also generate a lot of decoys, right? The attacker, right, doesn't really have time to kind of sift through what's real or not. They don't know, like, a priori, like, what is like the junk data we filled these files with or not. And so whenever they try to, for example, going back to the previous approach, I mean, the previous schematic, right, we kind of want to push malicious activity like above this threshold, right? We want to make something, a weird event, look really weird. And so this kind of helps us focus our attention, right, and defend our system. When we do these simulations, you might be asking, like, why do I want to sacrifice disk space to clog up my files with all this information, with all this junk data, right? And so that's another key thing we looked at, and I will demonstrate shortly, is that we want to minimize impact to the user as well. So all this can be made transparent to the user, right? And so kind of here's kind of like, this also shows kind of how our simulation works, right? We model an attack kind of implementing our system. So the attacker's trying to grab as many records as they can. However, if we see the $ symbol here, those are like the real files, right? But we flood the database table or the file system with so many decoys, and we inflate them to such a big size that if they try to take everything all at once, it's going to make a very big, obvious spike. If they try to take everything over a long period of time, it's never going to finish. So the idea is to kind of like frustrate them, to kind of influence the behavior such that they give up, or that their actions become very clear on the network. And so this is kind of output from our simulations, right? If you can see at the top of this surface, that's the payoff to the attacker, a normalized payoff. So when you're at 1, that means the attacker has extracted everything off your system. And you can see the other axes, right, include variables such as disk commitment. So how much of my disk am I willing to put in to inflating these files, and how many decoys am I willing to make at the same time? And you can see that we win when we put more resources in to doing so, right? So we've effectively eliminated payoff to the attacker when it's at the bottom. And so it becomes an optimization problem in this case. This is the key dynamic component to our approach, right? And so the analysts, what they can do as well, is that they can supply the simulation with historical data, right? So that they can select upfront a threshold such that it equates to a certain number of alerts they're willing to deal with every day. Say their attention, right? Their staff is only able to deal with 100 alerts. So you can figure that out beforehand with this optimization scheme. So a couple notes on deception. Something we want to make clear, and what others have said, is that deception is not security through obscurity. Eugene Spafford kind of elaborated on Yule's definition, right? Deception, what it is planned actions that we take and we design into the system such that we kind of want to mislead the attacker. We want to push them into a corner, right? Such that they have to put more skin in the game. And so in doing so, they kind of risk exposing themselves, right? That's the main idea, right? Unlike security through obscurity, right? It's not a design choice at all. This is hiding your implementation, right? And so there's kind of two categories we've kind of been looking at deception. There's deception as detection, right? This is kind of your classic honey tokens, honey servers, honey everything, right? We kind of, when we were, our early research, we're looking at deception kind of as direction, right? We want to direct the attacker's actions, right? We want to give options to the analyst, right? It's kind of like a means to set up your system in a way that it can fight back against the attacker in a way, kind of setting up a minefield of sorts. And so our goal here, right, again, I will say it over and over, we want to make the attacker very visible to us. We don't want to deal with the base rate fallacy. As a lot of analysts will tell you today, they're just overwhelmed with false positives. And so we add a dynamic component using our simulations, right? The key idea is that, you know, the network itself, your host network, is a key, is the key that helps configure itself, right? So the emergent properties of your network, like the historical traffic volume, right, is what we use to reconfigure yourself, right? So you are always having the attacker to invest a lot of energy at all times, right? It's never like a static thing. So we're moving away from the static threshold to a dynamic one and incorporating deceptive elements as well. So now I'll transition to the methods. This is where the bulk of my work went in with Michael Collins and company. So I focus a lot on the generation of artifacts, right? And as Michael Collins likes to say, he enjoys lying for fun and profit, pretty much. So I used a lot of techniques from natural language processing in this, and some techniques from malware, such as steganography and file header spoofing as well. So I'll take you through the document generation first. The methods, this is the basic workflow. For example, we'll take a corpus of documents, right? It's going to kind of look like your organization, right? If it's a medical research organization, you could probably download a lot of articles from PubMed, for example. Depending on how you do it, you can even use your own documents, right? Because you'll see that my approach is to kind of like extract keywords, right? To make these decoys look realistic. And so that's where a lot of natural language processing comes in. And then I'll show you some approaches to kind of like actually assembling these decoys. And so again, we kind of want to flood the system, right? Based off a number of documents you want to protect, right? And using our simulation, you can get a recommended number of decoys to make. And it has to be big enough such that any like random attempt at exfiltration, they'll end up with a lot of decoys instead of real files, right? These dollar signs here. And so a lot of the techniques, they have a wide variety of purposes in academia. They draw from context-free grammars, or the approach that I kind of came up with, the Mad Libs approach. There's also the Markov model generation, but I won't go into that today, but that's a classic approach as well. So a lot of purpose is parody, or sometimes recently I think the journal Science did a sting operation on predatory journals where they generated a lot of fake research, right? And those those fake papers that they made, those that got accepted, those are the predatory journals, because it is complete nonsense. And so one of our colleagues at the time, Brian Satira, he made a very critical observation that document generation only has to be good enough, right? It does not have to be a perfect lie. Because what you're trying to fool is malware. You're either trying to fool malware that's looking for keywords, right? You know, this says top secret, what have you. Or you're trying to fool non-native speaker. And the malware and the non-native speaker, or anyone really in general, doesn't have enough time to say like, oh no, this is garbage, right? I'm not going to bother not exfiltrating this. They're usually worried about with minimizing their time on the system, zipping everything up and taking it out. So yes, and so kind of key, an example I included here draws from this observation, right? There's a site called Snarchive versus Archive. I don't know if anyone's familiar with Archive. It's usually a mathematical pre-publication service. And so sometimes they have very esoteric looking titles, but it's legit research. But the average person is not going to tell which one's the real article, right? So the Snarchive is kind of like they'll make a nonsense journal title, and they'll have users guess which one's the real one. So we take a second, try to guess which one's the real one here, which one's the fake one, right? This is a fake one. And so the site will rate you and compare you to how other users performed, right? Pretty much coin flip, right? 50% thought that was the real one. So I did this a couple tries, and I got rated as a 9th year grad student, which hopefully I won't end up as one. So another tool from MIT is called SciGen. It makes fake computer science journals. They also did a couple of humorous sting operations themselves. Got a couple papers accepted, and even a conference at one time. So this is just complete context-free grammar. I believe they use some Markov model type things to make these things, and they'll complete with graphs, right? Just a quick glance, you see this is response time measured with respect to bandwidth, and bandwidth units are decibels, right? So it's just, this is nonsense, but it's useful to us in our approach. So first thing you have to do is assemble your corpus, right? Depending on how big your process, depending on the system you want to implement this on, right? You have to consider a lot of resources, right? And so when we were setting this up, we didn't have a lot of resources, right? So I kind of got like a quick corpus of documents that I got, right? Also, key point, right? If you're using corpus from Wikipedia or whatnot, it might have sensitive information. Depending on your organization, it will have classified documents. And so you have to be very careful with assembling a corpus depending on where you're working at. So here I use Wikipedia. I use a curated list of topics. You'll see later, actually use the list of clinically relevant bacteria. And the goal was to make an article from a cat. The Wikipedia entry for cat looked more like a bacteria article. I'll show you that shortly. But here, you can use a lot of basic tools to assemble your corpus. So here I use curl. and I used a very powerful tool called JQ. I don't know if anyone here is familiar with Unix core tools such as like awk or sed or whatnot. JQ is kind of like sed for JSON. So you can do a lot of powerful JSON processing with JQ. So I get the JSON response from Wikipedia, and you can parse it out with this very powerful language here. So it's very hard to see here, I apologize, but you pretty much access it like it were like in a JavaScript code or Python code. You just access your properties with dots, right? I want the dot query property. I want the dot query dot pages sub-object. You can do a lot of fancy filter type operations, such as map, right? I want to access this property for each object. Very quick way to get started once you get familiar. And I believe JQ has a sandbox site I recommend looking at to play around with this language, right? And finally get the last element of what I want. And then there I have the article for cat that I'll show you in upcoming example. Other things to consider, natural language processing is not trivial. Depending on how realistic you want to make your documents, right? I'll show you that. A good example is tokenization, right? So there's one of my favorite quotes that I'll show you what it looks like when you split it naively versus a more like natural language processing aware approach, right? If you do just dot split, this is a Python example. Right, the more advanced approach to tokenizing this, right, will consider the token isn't differently, right? It'll split it up into is and not. It'll preserve the apostrophe. It depends whether you want that or not, but it's something to be aware of when generating your artifacts. Excuse me. Another thing to get rid of when you're doing a lot of natural language is to get rid of stop words, right? And you can get, these lists are available from different sources. This one's from Google. Stop words are kind of words that are very common, like the, of, and, etc. And they kind of interfere with like extracting a meaningful signal from your corpus. So it's kind of like a natural language processing thing. You want to enhance, like kind of like, in our case, kind of like we want to get keywords from a specific collection of documents. So a keyword is not going to be the in any corpus, pretty much. Just a quick code example, putting it all together, right? I have my transformer, I have my tokenizer, other filters, right? So here I constructed a quick generator that applies all these filters, right? And the idea here is to kind of have it more streamlined and do a streaming processing. So finally, kind of taking all that into consideration, you have your corpus, you've applied your filters, right? You just have a bag of words, pretty much. You can use a concept from very early NLP, right? It's the term frequency inverse document frequency metric. You apply these equations on your corpus, right? It will help you kind of rank which words are kind of more important with respect to a document corpus, right? It's kind of similar to Google's PageRank, right? So which words are more important to whatever web pages, right? So in this case, what words are more important in your topic that in our case we want to get the keywords out of? And so that corpus that I mentioned earlier, right? It was a set of clinically important bacteria, right? These were the terms that I got from the links I downloaded. And so I'll show you how this comes into play. And so the score, right, the higher it is, the more relevant it is to my corpus. Another important tool that I use is called Pandoc. And depending on the documents that you want to make, right, you want to make PDFs, you want to make HTML, you want to make RTF. This is a very quick and dirty way to go from like Markdown, for example, into a very like realistic looking PDF, very simply. You don't have to use any fancy libraries or anything. it's able to interconvert from a lot of formats. It'll save you a lot of time. It's very powerful as well. And this kind of an example of Markdown, right? And a kind of like a preview pane is using the Atom editor. Not sure if they're using Pandoc behind the scenes, but I wouldn't be surprised to give you the preview. So here I'll introduce the approach I developed called it's just Mad Libs, pretty much. I'll walk you through it, but at the end of the day, it's just Mad Libs. Right, it kind of plays off the idea that it just has to look good enough. My document. Take a document, and then you're actually, let me step back. I'm going to take my corpus. I'm going to extract all the keywords. I'm going to map all the parts of speech that are present in that corpus. I'm going to map them to the list of words that they correspond to. And the reason is I'm going to visit every word in a template document. I'm going to probabilistically flip a coin, like is it on my threshold? I'm going to say what part of speech is it? And I'm going to randomly take a list of words from my mapping and replace it with the same part of speech. So I'm replacing words from my template document based off part of speech from my keywords. Right? It's kind of like a mapping example, right? All my nouns from my corpus is just a small subset. All my adverbs, all my verbs. This is my keywords mapped by part of speech I will use to replace words in my template. So here's an example. This is the Wikipedia entry for cat. I've highlighted the parts that got replaced. I'll show you in the next slide what it looks like, right? In the green, those are the words that got replaced. In the yellow, those were sentences that I thought were kind of funny looking. First thing to note is that the grammar, the capitalization was not preserved. I didn't put effort into doing that, but that's something that you can consider in your approach if you want to do something like this. You see that there's space between the commas, what have you. That's just how it turned out in my implementation. You see, right, Latin name, virulent catus, right, obviously red flag there. There's no need to anthrax them. They're similar in anatomy to other microbes, and their teeth are adapted to killing small bacterium, right? This is complete nonsense, but I've made it in a TF-IDF kind of like perspective, right? It's more bacterial sounding, right? Very simple, very effective. So this will be probably very good against a malware that's just looking for keywords. This is leveraging the SciGen tool itself. You can get the SciGen code from GitHub. It's a set of Perl scripts and GNU plot scripts. Not very hard to modify or execute. It'll give you a PostScript file as output or raw LaTeX. You can give it to Pandoc. It'll turn into a PDF for you, no problem. Here what I did, I took one of their source files it's part of their free grammar setup, right? They have a list mapping like, this is my list of science buzzwords that are plural nouns. These are my buzzwords that are nouns. These are my adjectives are very sciencey sounding, So what I did was I kind of inserted key points here to have my script. I have another script that will look for these tags and replace it with keywords that correspond to the part of speech. And so that's a way that I kind of hacked SciGen in a way to kind of like have it use my words instead of their words that it comes with. So I then regenerated, I generated one of their computer science articles, but this time it has more bacterial, more words that come from the bacterial articles, right? The green, again, those are words that got replaced, right? So their unified flexible theory have led to many edema advances, including antibiotics and clumps, right? That's a computer science paper that got bacterialized, I guess you could say. So that's another approach you can use if you don't want to use mad libs. You want to use a more kind of out-of-the-box approach. So we take these freshly generated decoy documents, and so what can you do with them now, right? You can take these documents, right? You can litter your file system with them, or you can take these documents and you can hide the files you want to protect within their alternate data stream. This is a technique borrowed from malware. This is something that malware actually uses to hide from antivirus. And so this example here is specific to NTFS, I have to point out. This is ADS is technically a fork. Apple has this as well, resource forks. I'm not too sure about Unix type systems, but I know both Apple and Microsoft implement something like this. And so when you're dealing with ADS, when I was actually researching it, what they were in the first place, I stumbled on an article, and the first thing it says is, it is a data stream that is alternate. So I laughed at that, but that's the best way to describe it. Because when you're dealing with an NTSF file, the data that you're accessing or messing with is the unnamed stream, right? And so on the command line, this is how you would access it, for example. That's where all the actual data goes to. And you can put as many streams as you want on these files. Just give it a name, and just do your regular old DOS batch commands. Or if you have PowerShell, there's a set of commandlets that gives you kind of a better interface for that, a fancier interface. I believe it's called streams.exe that you can get from Microsoft to expose what ADSs are present on a file. But with respect to our approach, if we want to hide files, right, at the top here, I'm echoing a string to a document, creating a document that has that text. It's size 19 bytes. I'm making another file. It's a bigger string of text. It's 45 bytes. But now I'm taking that whole document, that second document, I'm putting it in an ADS stream of the first one, and what you see here is the same size as it was originally. The user is completely unaware of how big that document is. You can put gigabytes of information in an ADS stream, and you will be unaware of it. And you think, why would you want this? Well, there's a lot of niche use cases, but this is something that people get scared of a lot because, again, it's what malware leverages a lot of times. Any process that is ADS unaware, right, is not going to know of its existence. And so this gives us another defensive advantage, right? Another red flag that you can raise is, any typical user that's poking around in an ADS, that's a huge red flag, for example, right? Why do they know to look around there, right? So if it was like an attacker looking around ADS on your system, right, that's immediate cause for concern. Another defensive advantage that it gives you, anytime you copy over an NTSF file to another file system, ADS is not transferred. Another thing, another defense, when you zip up your files, zip is not going to preserve ADS. It's not ADS aware. If you email it, that's another ADS unaware thing, right? So you have all these layers of defense if you go through this approach. There's something that we played around with a lot. We still have work to do with, but you can definitely kind of set up a file system of types, just messing around with ADS, keeping your protected files in these locations. Another thing we played around with, this kind of goes back to when I mentioned user friendliness, right? Can I use steganography in a way to kind of have the user unaware of all this junk data I'm putting into these files to protect them. The idea was open office documents, they're all zip files by definition. Right? If you take your zip file, I mean, you take your Microsoft Office document, your Word document, your Excel, your PowerPoint, you put a .zip at the end, you can unzip it and look at all the XML goodies it has inside. So I thought I can use file header spoofing. This isn't anything new. You can take the central directory of the zip file and simply delete it. And so your unzip tool, right, say I take file entry 2 here, I actually leave it intact in the local file header, right? And here you have the actual meat of the data that's compressed. This directory listing, I delete that directory listing, right? I unzip it, it's not going to be unzipped, right? It's still going to remain in the zip document, but it will not be exploded. I thought I could fool Microsoft Word in this way, but that ended up being unproductive. But I still want to talk about this because who knows, someone else might find a good way to do this or not. I thought it's still valuable to talk about. So basically, it's very simple to do this, right? For each directory header listing, right? You know, if this is one of the things I want to hide from a zip format aware tool, you're going to have to calculate how big its entries are in the headers, right? Because if I don't resize it appropriately, zip's going to complain. So it's like kind of like going through the header entries and making sure that I kind of clean up afterwards when I'm trying to delete, when I go to delete these entries in the directory listing. So kind of a schematic of what the central directory file listing looks like. You can see that especially the bottom 3 entries you have to be careful with. Everything else will be kind of the same size, but you have to kind of account for how big the file name is for this listing. Because when you go to truncate your file, you have to make sure there's no junk data at the end, or zip or Word will complain immediately. So same with the end of central directory listing, right? This is kind of like the last header in the zip, I believe. And so this is where you update, this is where you lie about how many things I have in my zip file. This is kind of like the last piece to consider. So this example of my steganography tool in action, this is kind of a toy example. But I'm taking the actual core. This is running the unzip-l command. It'll just give you a listing of everything in your zip file. This is a listing of everything in a Word document. And the document.xml, that's where all my words are, right? That's where my text is. So what I did here, I said I want to hide this document from a zip-aware process, such as unzip. Highlighted the file size, it's 10 kilobytes. Here it's saying there's 14 files. After running the command, you see the file size remains unchanged. Because all I'm saying is this file is not here even though it is. So that's what it should look like. And it's giving me 13 files are here. So this worked. We try to open Word, and this example is not going to work obviously because I'm hiding document.xml. But if I was trying to hide another payload in here, I think Word still freaked out for me on both Mac and Windows. So I went another route for that, which I can mention later on. Here's what it looks like if you actually delete document.xml. See, the file size is different. I went from 10 kilobytes to 8.4 kilobytes, just for reference. And so what we actually did to inflate files, we made a random entry in the Open Office document. We just pumped it full of random bytes that are uncompressible. And Word, you can try this on either Mac or Windows. Make a random entry in the Open Office document, fill it with whatever data you want, MP3s, whatever, zip it back up, and then open it with Word, and it should work just as fine for you. Only the thing we're having trouble with now, when we were researching this, is that after you save a document and you had a payload in there, it will get rid of it after the fact. But it won't complain when you open it, for whatever reason. Just something to think about there. It's kind of strange behavior. So this kind of that's kind of like the core ideas that our approach takes and kind of assembles together, right? We have a dynamic component where we simulate how many based on our resources, right? How much we're willing to invest to take the payoff, to try to minimize attacker payoff, right? How much disk space I'm willing to commit. So based on those questions, right, you can get an answer, right? This is how many decoys you have to make. This is how big you have to make them in our scheme. So kind of putting that all together, right, you can end up with a file system, right? We kind of like the list of real files and decoys that we want to protect in particular, right? We kind of like term that the minefield. We have a process that monitors, we call this troop, our approach, by the way, because we call these files, since they grow rapidly under the right conditions, right? We kind of call those mushroom files. And then troop is the collective noun for mushrooms, by the way. So it's like kind of like the troop approach, right? We kind of go into that. We mentioned that as well in our RSA talk. But basically, yeah, we have a dynamic system that leverages a lot of the techniques from deception and malware. We have a system that reconfigures itself dynamically to kind of keep the attacker on their toes, have them put a lot of skin in the game, make their actions very visible to us, and limit their payoff. And so the next step, we are actively trying to set up a community in this research area. You can visit our website at dynamicdefenses.org. We have a list of publications there that's relevant to our research. We invite you to join. Still a lot of work to do in this area. It's very simple approach, very effective, and we're very excited about it, and we invite you to join us. Thank you very much. Yeah. Yes.
So you guys are a research company. Do you guys do investigations into
That's probably more. I would guess that Redjack's more involved in that. I believe. I only say guess because it had been 2 years since I had worked on the child exploitation stuff. I believe they have actually done work in actual investigations. They have actually broken up rings and helped people be prosecuted for that. But for exploitation, yeah. For exploitation, we have not been involved in those cases, yeah. I would think that's very common because you don't want to have a big spike in network traffic. You want to lay low, you know what I mean? You don't want to trigger any thresholds here. That's part of the reason why we use inflation with uncompressible bytes. Because by definition, random data is uncompressible. So when they try to zip something up, it's not going to be zipped, right? Sample bytes from dev random, put that into a file and then zip it up, is going to be the same file size as uncompressed. So when they try to grab as many documents as possible, right, through some automated malware, it's going to be a big spike of fake data being transferred over the network. Yes.
In
terms of deception, one of the big challenges is that if in any way, shape, or form your solution becomes fingerprintable, your deception methodology is burned. And it's burned until you figure out a way to create a new set of deceptions. One of my questions would be in that case, in terms of what you've shown here, I didn't see any changes to metadata to the file, to dates the files are created, or to authors. So a really good bad guy during their enumeration process will go and look and see that these aren't all files created on the same date and therefore potentially planted on the same date or littered into the environment on the same date. Do you have pieces that are going to be part of this set of work for the future that include that, or is that something that's already built in?
Yeah, at the point it's not built in. I'm not sure if Michael had that in mind at the moment. It's all very early research at the moment, but those are very good points. And those are something that we can definitely consider in our future designs, in our next work. Yeah, definitely spoofing file creation dates and all that is definitely a good avenue to go down for this research. Yeah, again, like another, our point here, we want to assemble a lot of different techniques, right? We kind of want to make a framework in a sense that you can take our dynamic component and just put in kind of like your own plugin in a way. You know what I mean? Like add more layers of deception. All right. Any more questions? If not, yeah, feel free to contact us and please visit our site.